can probably hear Donald Trump's very noisy supporters here behind me. I can just about hear you. That press conference you referred to from the doctors a while back, if it was meant to be clear and honest, unlike yesterday's, I have to say it's probably sown the same degree of confusion, if not more. And why? Well, because it was forced to begin with a mea culpa. The president's doctors admitting for the first time that he had been given oxygen in the White House on Friday, and that is why ultimately he was transferred to the hospital here. The doctors saying that he hadn't wanted to admit that yesterday, despite that grilling he got from journalists, because he instead wanted to reflect what he called the upbeat attitude of the president. But in doing so, the doctor admitted today that he realized it had come off, he said, like we were trying to hide something, which wasn't necessarily true. Not very reassuring words there from the doctor. In other words, he was doing the president's political spinning for him and not really just giving a clear, unvarnished representation of the president's condition. He then went on to admit that the president's oxygen levels had fallen again yesterday and that they had put him on a new steroid drug called, I'll look down here, dexamethasone, which we know is reserved for more severe cases of COVID-19, not least because it serves to suppress the body's immune system. And yet, despite all this, they say that he's doing well, that he's up and about walking and eating, and that he may even be discharged tomorrow. So again, I would say quite an unclear picture of what's really going on there behind me. As to the polls, one last point. The latest has his Democratic rival Joe Biden 10 points ahead of Donald Trump, ahead of the election on November the 3rd, while the majority of Americans believe that Donald Trump could have avoided the infection and the condition he now finds himself in if he had taken the virus more seriously in the first place.
I came here, wasn't feeling so well. I feel much better now. We're working hard to get me all the way back. I have to be back.
Pale, suited, but with no tie, Donald Trump delivered a message to the nation from his hospital suite last night, an attempt to reassure the president was doing well after testing positive for COVID-19, but acknowledging too the next few days could determine his fate.
You don't know over the next period of a few days. I guess that's the real test. So we'll be seeing what happens over those next couple of days.
Today, his doctors once again tried to strike an upbeat tone, though admitted he was now on medication typically associated with more severe COVID-19 cases, but said he could still be released as soon as tomorrow.
Regarding his clinical status, the patient continues to improve. He has remained without fever since Friday morning. His vital signs are stable. From a pulmonary standpoint, he remains on room air this morning and is not complaining of shortness of breath or other significant respiratory symptoms.
They were treading carefully after yesterday sowing confusion during a televised press conference where they insisted the president was recovering, but also suggested that he had been diagnosed with COVID-19 earlier than officially reported.
Just 72 hours into the diagnosis now.
An admission that implied the president, who tested positive late on Thursday, may in fact have been diagnosed on Wednesday. Then another doctor referred to an antibody treatment the president received about 48 hours ago, which would have been before the public was told he was sick. Adding to the confusion was this. The president's chief of staff waited for the doctors to leave before ushering the White House press team to one side to give them an unvarnished version of events.
Obviously, the cameras are still rolling, so if we can go off the record with some of y'all and get away from the cameras.
That the president's health over the last 24 hours had been very concerning and that the next 48 hours would be critical in terms of his care.
Yesterday, you told us that the president was in great shape, had been in good shape and fever-free for the previous 24 hours. Minutes after your press conference, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows told reporters that the president's vitals were very concerning over the past 24 hours. Simple question for the American people. Whose statements about the president's health should we believe?
So the chief and I work side by side, and I think his statement was misconstrued. I was trying to reflect the upbeat attitude that the team, and in doing so, it came off that we were trying to hide something, which wasn't necessarily true.
The timeline for the president's diagnosis matters because we know he continued with his schedule on Thursday despite knowing Hope Hicks, one of his closest aides, who had travelled with him that week on Air Force One, had tested positive the day before. But could he himself have been showing symptoms too, or even received treatment for them? It also matters because more and more people around the president have contracted the virus. Many of them here at this event last weekend in the White House Rose Garden, where President Trump named his nominee for Supreme Court Justice. The most recent was Chris Christie, who advised Mr. Trump ahead of the first presidential debate, but so too close aide Kellyanne Conway. But the president wants us to believe it could soon be back to business.
But I'm also doing well, and I think we're going to have a very good result.
The White House later released photos of the president apparently busy at work, diligently signing documents.
God bless Trump! God bless Trump!
And even though we now know his oxygen levels are being treated with more serious medication, they claim he may be released as soon as tomorrow.
Siobhan Kennedy. Well, I'm joined now by Lawrence Gostin, who's director of the World Health Organization on Global Health Law and professor of Global Health Law at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Professor, thanks very much for being with us. This is a dog's dinner, isn't it? We learned today of 2 interventions with oxygen from the medics, but it's the New York Times and the AP who told the American people and the world that last night. What a mess.
Well, it is. It's really deeply concerning, and thank you very much for having me on. I mean, we were not told about the president needing oxygen, and needing oxygen is a really critical indicator of a relatively serious course of disease, and in fact, it seemed to have been hidden, or whether it was being upbeat, whatever it is. The lack of honesty, truthfulness, transparency, and just so we can understand the president's condition was badly lacking. And the American people do have the right to know. The world has the right to know. Which leads naturally on to the next question, being obviously the current course of drugs, the continuing use of steroids and so forth. As a scientist, as a medic, what should we read into that? Well, normally when we use things like an antiviral medication and also steroids, both of which are used, they're intended for either seriously ill or hospitalized patients and those who are needing supplemental oxygen. They're usually not a good sign, particularly with the president being at the highest risk group, his age. He's overweight and probably CDC-defined obese, and he has other ongoing cardiovascular risk. So he is at a very, very high risk group, and having those treatments, if you think of it with other kinds of people in that risk group, you'd be very troubled. Although I do have to say the president sounded reasonably well in his video last night. And the latest we've heard is that he might come home as soon as tomorrow. That surprises me. It pleases me. We all wish the president well, and irrespective of our political differences. Of course, they did caveat that homecoming with possibly it's conditional. But what generally do you make of the White House protocol, the White House conduct, their behavior in all of this? I'm thinking of these gatherings in the Rose Garden and so forth, the huggings, the kissings, the lack of masks. I mean, one doesn't want to be puritanical about this, but it does look like that was a conference of super spreading. Yeah, I mean, it really was, and what you have, we're at the center of government in the White House and the Rose Garden. The same thing has happened in Congress. And so we have our 2 main governing institutions, the White House and the Congress, including the president, the vice president, all of the staff around him. And we're seeing major clusters of events. And it's really, the thing that concerns me the most is, depending upon the timeline, it seems almost likely that the president had reason to know that he was infected, or maybe even had a rapid positive test, and then went on campaign events. This is really very troubling because, it ignores the advice of his own scientific agencies, which have said mask up, socially distant, and self-isolate if you might have been in contact with someone. Those are the three major rules of the coronavirus response and proper behavior.
Of course.
And for the president and the White House not to have modeled that, I think is unforgivable.
Right, Professor, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for your thoughts. Of course, the president not here to defend himself, but I'm sure he will be asked directly on that last point that you make. Thanks very much indeed.